Well, hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of ENO. Let me first start off just by extending my best wishes to you and yours, and hoping that you are all safe and healthy, getting vaccinated. I am joined virtually by Christof Spieler. I suspect that Christof is well known to many of you. He is Vice President and Director of Planning at Hewitt-Zollars and a Senior Lecturer at Rice University in Texas. Christof is a tireless advocate for transit as a writer, community leader, planner, and transit agency board member. And he's been a great collaborator for us at ENO. He was on the advisory panel for a major initiative that we undertook over the last couple of years on transit costs and project delivery. He is here today to discuss his book, Trains, Buses, People, an Opinionated Atlas of U.S. Transit. This book was first published in 2018 and was recently republished in a fully updated second edition. It's a great book, and I don't think I'm blowing up his spot by saying that what I really like about it is that it takes transit out of its box and talks about measuring success, not by how much transit we build, by actually what you get out of the transit that you do build and how useful it is. I know that sounds straightforward, but it's really amazing, how often we tend to forget it. I'm sure folks here on the call have really good experiences where that is actually the case. So Christof is going to make the case for why all that matters, what we're doing wrong, and how to fix it, and in so doing, how to make millions of people's lives better every single day. That word "people" is in the title of his book, and it's something I think we often forget quite a bit in the industry. So after he does that, we will take questions. So please use the questions function on the webinar website to submit. You don't have to wait until the end to submit questions. You can send them along anytime, and we'll pick through those once he's done with the presentation. So I want to thank you all very much for joining us today. And with that, take it over, Christof.
Great. I am happy to be here and talking to a national audience in this very strange COVID world. And I'm happy to talk about Trains, Buses, People. We're going to do a presentation today, but spend a lot of time on Q&A since I'm really looking forward to what everybody wants to talk about. So I'll start by talking about the book, Trains, Buses, People, an Opinionated Atlas of US and Canadian Transit. For those of you who know me, the opinionated is an important part of that. What the book does is it goes through all of the metro areas that have rail or BRT, maps them all at the same scale, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of population distribution and jobs, looks at the stats for all of the systems those cities have, and then tells the story in each city. What decisions did that metropolitan area make, and how did those turn out in terms of a system? What the new book adds is two things. First of all, it adds Canada. I've included all of the Canadian metro areas as well, and there's some really amazing stories north of the border. I think it's a place that a lot of US transit people should spend a lot more time looking at. And secondly, I've been able to add better data, worked with Remix. The book actually maps out the frequent transit networks in every city it considers. And thanks to Remix, able to quantify how many people are served by those networks. And you'll see some of that later. In addition to that, the book starts with talking about the basics of transit, how that works, things like fares and alignments, and then has a section that talks about what makes successful transit. How do you build a high ridership transit system? And I'll start there because I think it's always important to remind us how that works. So first of all, density. You build transit where lots of people are, will get you lots of ridership. Secondly, activity, because it's not just about where people live, it's where they work, and it's all the other things they do. And with that goes walkability. We need to design transit that people can walk to because that's what high ridership transit is. If you try to base an entire system around park and ride, you're not going to get a strong transit network. Next, next, connectivity. You need to design a system that is truly a system, a line that doesn't stand alone, but actually connects to all of the other transit routes to make a truly comprehensive transit system. You need to make lines that are frequent because, as Jarrett Walker would say, frequency is freedom. Basically, this is the difference between transit that is there for you when you need it and transit that you have to plan your life around, something like an hourly bus route where you may have the choice of being 5 minutes late or 55 minutes early. And along with frequency goes travel time, which I always emphasize is door-to-door travel time. It's not how fast the bus or the train goes, it's how fast you get to your destination, including the walking and including the waiting. And equally important, reliability, the kind of thing that causes people to lose their jobs if you don't do it well. We need to actually get people where they're going when we promised them we'd get them there. Good transit provides capacity. The thing that transit is extraordinarily good at is a good use of urban space, something that is true post-COVID as much as it was true pre-COVID. Good transit simply moves a lot of people. And finally, legibility, which is we need transit that is easy to understand, something I think that we often undervalue when we design transit networks, and something that frankly we're not very good at in the United States. And finally, in this edition of the book, I remedied an oversight from the first edition and spent some more time focusing on inclusivity. We need transit networks that welcome everybody. And that obviously means we have to deal with the history of racism in transit and overcome that. It means we have to make transit networks accessible. It is utterly unacceptable to me that we have networks like the New York City subway system, which still leave people who are in wheelchairs behind. And it's lots of other things. I frequently give the example of stroller policies on transit. How do we make transit that's as friendly to ride if you're riding as a family as if you're riding by yourself? So all of this added together is actually pretty straightforward. I think one of the most important points in the book is transit planning is not a great mystery. It's actually very easy to spot which transit lines will be successful and which won't. And if you're a transit rider, you actually know all of this. But as the book shows, we're not very good at this. That if you look around the United States, you will see that we often get this wrong. Here's a map of multiple different rail systems laid over population density, and you can see how much those transit lines are actually missing the places where they do the most good. So how do we get better at this? Fundamentally, what this comes down to is to create good transit, we have to convince stakeholders and decision makers who do not ride transit. And people who don't ride transit really don't understand transit. And I would argue that as an industry, we have been really bad at explaining transit. So how do we have a better conversation? Because I believe if we have a better conversation around transit, we will end up with better transit systems. What do we do to get this right? First, I think we should always plan service and not infrastructure. Transit is not measured in terms of tracks and lanes and overpasses. Transit is measured in terms of getting people somewhere. And it strikes me how often when we have discussions about transit, we're only talking about the infrastructure and not what that service will actually mean to people. That means we focus on the experience for riders. We should always talk about transit in terms of what it means for the people who are riding it and how it will make their lives better. We have to design transit for all trips, not just white collar commutes. One of the things that's been clear during COVID is ridership has held up most strongly on those systems that are not just serving 9 to 5 white collar office jobs, that are serving all sorts of jobs, that are serving medical care, that are serving retail, that are getting people to the park, that are serving students. That's the kind of systems we need to build. And that means we have to change how we talk about transportation. I think in the transportation world, we often talk way too much about commutes when that's only a small portion of the overall picture of trips. We need to not get distracted by technology. We really need to avoid these technology discussions. And obviously, when I say this, one of the first things that will come to mind is people like Elon Musk and Hyperloop and everything else. And I very much think that we should not get ourselves distracted by that. But what I also mean with this is we shouldn't get distracted by bus versus rail debates. That I think technology mode is a tool for delivering transit. It's not the service we're delivering. And so what we should focus on is what places do we want to connect and what kind of service do we need to offer, right, between them. We have to make sure we don't take existing injustices for granted. We have inherited systems that were built in very racist eras. that have racism cooked into them in many ways, and we need to stand back and evaluate that. And it comes in things like standards for bus stops versus rail stations. We can't say simply, we've always done it this way, so we need to keep doing it this way. We need to recognize that we've done many things wrong, and we need to get better at doing those. And we should measure accomplishment not by miles or dollars, but by ridership and access. I don't care how many miles of rail your metro area built. I do not care how many $billion you spent. I care, did you make people's lives better? And you can measure making people's lives better in more people riding it. It means your transit is useful. And you can measure it in access, how many jobs people have access to, how many people have access to frequent transit. So if we were going to build systems based around those principles, what would that look like? So what I'm doing here is outlining what I think is it's a pretty good approach that pretty much applies to every metropolitan area. So first of all, we need all day show up and go transit serving as many people as possible. We need to focus on frequent networks. In the book, I actually map all of those. Those white bubbles there show you which people are within walking distance of frequent bus or rail service. And here's the stats for North American metropolitan areas as to what percentage of the people in the entire metro area, not just within one transit network, but the entire metro area, are within walking distance of frequent transit service. New York City clocks in at around 43%, which I would argue is far short of where it should be. Northern New Jersey, for example, is a major hole in terms of frequent networks. Some cities do impressively well. San Diego, 37%, Salt Lake City, 28%, LA, 22%. I would argue that could be a lot better. San Francisco Bay Area, 17%. That's actually pretty bad performance for a place that thinks of itself as really valuing transit. It's notable that the Bay Area does just barely better than Houston, Texas on this metric. Boston at 14%, we're working on making that one a lot better. And then you have areas at the bottom, Dallas-Fort Worth at 3%, though thanks to a network redesign that they are just implementing, and the network redesign that I actually helped work on in Fort Worth, that number now looks a lot better. What's notable, though, when you look at these is how much the Canadian cities stand out. Here's a chart of overall transit ridership by metro area, and notice how all of the Canadian cities dramatically outperform their peers. North American champion on frequent access is actually Vancouver. Once we have frequent transit, we need to make sure it's reliable, and that means high capacity lines in the highest ridership corridors, and that means dedicated lanes. So things like New York City is doing in a very tactical way of doing busways, but also the gold standard of that, which is dedicated median running bus lanes where buses are free from the kind of turn conflicts that they end up with otherwise. Indianapolis has done a great job of this. Oakland, California, you'll see another good project here. I'm seeing an increasing number of this, so there's some really good models to follow. And as you build that network, you want reliable, high capacity lines in the highest ridership corridors. Good rapid transit is transit that actually acts as a spine for the overall transit network. And I give Boston as an example here because this is a place that has long planned around rapid transit and bus working together. What you see here in thick lines are the rapid transit lines in Boston. The thin lines are the bus routes feeding into them, color-coded by which line they feed into. And so what you can see is that each of these subway lines has essentially a tributary area of bus routes that feed into it, which means that line helps way more people than simply the people who live along it. And that's what good rail and BRT do. They act as spines of an overall network, which means the key decision we need to make when we have a discussion about building new rail and BRT lines is which corridors do we pick? Because we need to pick the corridors that will actually do the most good in terms of helping the overall network. And we also need to really think about the design philosophy of our systems, because this has really changed over time. If you look at pre-war systems, much shorter lines concentrated in the urban core, closely spaced stations, walkable neighborhoods. And then you look at a lot of post-war systems, which are focused on getting to the suburbs as quickly as possible, fewer stations in walkable neighborhoods, much larger station spacing for speed. And 80s light rail in many ways inherited that. I think the pattern we're starting to see now is things like what you see in Minneapolis, St. Paul at bottom right, where you really start seeing light rail and BRT as part of an overall transit network rather than as a standalone system layered on top of a bus network. I think one city that's actually doing this really well is Austin. This is the Austin Transit Plan, where first of all, you can see it's focusing BRT and light rail in the densest parts of the area where the most jobs are. But secondly, it's very much designed to work with a frequent bus network so that those buses connect, feed into that rail system. Another place that's doing this incredibly well is Seattle, where every light rail expansion has meant a redesign of the bus network so that a lot of bus riders benefit from those faster trips into downtown University of Washington. And when you build networks like that, you end up building networks that serve a lot of different kinds of trips. I think one of the best measures of a transit system is what parts of your life can you actually live on here? Not just can it take you to work, but can it take you to the hospital? Can it take you to the baseball game? Can it take you shopping? And that's where systems like New York really excel. And you can see that if you look at the bottom of this list, you'll see some cities that made very different decisions. And the strongest ridership is actually in places like Houston and Minneapolis, where we're serving all these different kinds of destinations. I should also note, obviously, that in some of our biggest metro areas, these lines already exist. But we really should be thinking about how to make them better for people. We should be thinking about how do we make these lines more convenient, more efficient, more reliable. And we know what the national and worldwide states of the art look like that. That on heavy rail, for example, we really should be thinking about automated trains for more frequent service. And on commuter rail, we really should be thinking about systems that are really integrated with the entire transit system, that run frequently, that have level boarding, all of the things that really makes that system more useful to more people. We also need to take that thinking out into the suburbs. And when I say suburbs, I mean areas outside the pre-World War II urban cores. There's actually a surprising amount of diversity of land use and activity in these places. I think often in sort of thinking of something as a suburb, we assume that it is simply single family homes. But if you look at the maps in the book, you'll see that in a lot of metro areas, some of the densest areas are actually outside those pre-war cores. And so there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of people, and one of the real things that's happening is that there's actually a lot of low-income residents who live in suburban areas right now and would really benefit from much better transit. But when we're talking about suburban transit here, this is suburban all-purpose transit. This isn't let's drive lines into the suburbs to serve park and ride lots so people can get to their jobs downtown. This isn't put stations wherever they happen to be most convenient. This is design lines that really serve all of people's needs in the suburbs. And you are starting to see some cities really do things like that. Houston's Silver Line BRT serving a 1970s, 1980s suburban employment center and connecting it to the regional express bus network. But no city has done as well at this as Vancouver, a city which has literally been transformed around its transit systems, where you have frequent SkyTrain service and clusters of new development around every one of those stations, giving lots of people the benefit of that network, and really designed in a way that helps people's lives. So here, for example, you can see a Safeway store that is literally integrated into the station so that you can grab your groceries as you get off the train and you walk home. Those same networks also need to be extended across the entire country. We need better connections between cities, and we need better connections to rural areas. Here is our map of intercity rail frequency in the United States, and there are some places which look very good on this map. San Francisco, Sacramento, for example, in the Northeast Corridor, but there are some glaring omissions here, and we could do much better in terms of providing that intercity service. Sometimes that's actually an opportunity for commuter rail and Amtrak to integrate better, like they're doing in Connecticut on the Hartford line, where the same ticket will allow you to ride both. But this is also about buses, and it's also about small towns. It can make a huge difference to people's lives to have just a couple of buses a day connecting to small towns. And our intercity bus networks that are privately operated, I think are slowly decaying, or sometimes very quickly decaying, like Western Canada. And I think that states really ought to be thinking about how to fill that gap. And then as we do all of those services, we need to integrate them. Seamless connections that tie bus and rail together, something that Toronto, for example, does incredibly well. Here you can see a Toronto subway station that has bus bays integrated right into it. So you do not even need to step outside to transfer to the bus. You will not get wet when you're transferring to that bus. You have a heated waiting area. This is what makes that connection seamless. And as a result of that, Toronto has a network where basically every bus route feeds into a rail line, and those rail lines really turn that whole thing into an integrated system. Almost everybody in Toronto is able to benefit from those subway lines because of those connections. And once we've created the networks, we need to make them legible. This is the A line in Minneapolis-St. Paul. It has a name at every station. It tells you which direction the bus is running. It has full information on maps and schedules. It has real-time arrival information. This is what we do to make transit easy to understand. And that means we have to offer good passenger information. It also means we actually need to redesign networks. This is a bit of St. Paul right here. Different colors are different bus route numbers, different lines are different versions of those bus routes. This is way too confusing. And we need to actually deal with fares. I think the question about fares is not even so much can people afford to pay them, it's do they act as an obstacle to people using transit? And in a lot of our metropolitan areas, the methods we use to collect fares, and even more so, the integration between different agencies are a real obstacle to using transit. The bottom line on fares, the bottom line on all of this is when we talk about transit, we shouldn't really be talking about trains and buses. We should be talking about people. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to your questions. You can also email me, cspieler@hewittzollers.com. Definitely follow me on Twitter at Christof Spieler. And if you go to islandpress.org and use the promo code webinar, you can actually get 30% off the book. And with that.
Great. Thank you very much, Christof. It's really, really terrific presentation. Great use of visuals and photographs. And I should note at the beginning, I forgot to have the word Canada in the title of the second edition of the book. So you can tell that I read the first one because it didn't have Canada.
Yeah, we had to actually think about how to rename the book. As it doesn't include Mexico, we couldn't do North American. That's definitely a goal I have, though, is there's lots to learn about south of the border too.
Yes, no, the Canadian examples are very helpful. And let me jump to some questions and some comments. They're coming in fast here, so please go ahead and continue to use that questions function on the webinar website. And I'm going to start off with one. Actually, this came up in the session just before we turned this on. Jonathan Hammond here at Eno is a program associate, and actually asked a great question. I'd love to hear your opinion on this. As you were doing this work, there are transit cities and metros that we all kind of think about as either very good high quality or very poor quality. Which ones particularly stuck out to you and surprised you as you were doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, and that's been with both editions. In the first edition, what really struck me going through this is there are a couple U.S. metro areas which are just quite fundamentally good at transit. I mentioned Seattle. I think they do an amazing job all around, and it's not just one agency. It's really all of the agencies up there are doing very impressive work, not just Sound Transit, but King County Metro and Community Transit in Pierce County. It seems to be a place where that's really built a culture of building good transit and what good transit means. And it's also a place where those agencies actually work together incredibly well, which growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I know what it looks like when agencies don't work together. So it's always great to see that. The Twin Cities are another place that strikes me as having an incredibly competent transit agency that has done some really amazing projects and really seems to understand how things work as a network. It also really struck me in the first edition that there's some smaller cities which I don't think get the credit they deserve. Richmond, Virginia, for example, El Paso, Texas. Fort Collins, Colorado has a really useful BRT line that goes right through the middle of its university campus. I think we often sort of tend to think only about the big cities when we think about transit, and there's actually some really amazing success stories among smaller cities. In the second edition, I mean, Canada is truly amazing. The ridership levels up there, sort of the quality of what they have built. I mean, essentially, if you look at the United States and Canada, nearly every Canadian system is above average. Um, and a lot of it is simply they provide a lot of service, which you can really show on those maps. But again, I think you see cities, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, are really outstanding in terms of the networks they've built and sort of the thinking and planning behind them. I'll say another one that really jumped out to me when I saw it for the second edition is Indianapolis is really a pretty amazing success story. Um, Even though they've been fighting the state legislature every step of the way and trying to make transit better, they've actually put some really amazing transit on the ground very quickly. That's really high quality.
Let's stick on Canada just for a second. Just we've got a ton of questions. Maybe a lot of Canadians here on the call interested. You talked a little bit about what what is Canada doing right. I think that's the general kind of frame for a lot of these questions. But and specifically, when you tick through those nine, the 9 key factors, is there anything that stands out? Is it fair integration? Is it something that you can be specific and pinpoint that they're really doing well? You talked about service and accessibility, I think.
I mean, number one is frequency. Is that Canadian cities simply operate a lot more frequent transit than U.S. cities do, um, and and that goes with connectivity. I think in general, Canadian cities are really good at integrating bus and rail. I mean, there's exceptions there, but in general, that the pattern feels like they really understand that the two go together. Whereas in the United States, we have a lot of cities where they essentially overlay on each other, but have almost nothing to do with each other. I mean, really prominent example, Washington, D.C., where the bus network within the city and the rail network within the city are almost independent of each other. And there's actually the bus riders don't really benefit from the rail. Most rail riders don't benefit from them. But like that's something that Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal are doing a much better job at. Um, I think that there is also some real land use difference. And to me, the most dramatic land use difference tends to be, again, outside those pre-war urban cores that Toronto, for example, has quite a few suburban centers that actually are also major transit hubs, so that it may be a mall in the center surrounded by high-rise residential and office towers, but they very much see transit as part of that, and the structure of the Canadian transit systems, I think, generally reflect that. I mentioned Vancouver is obviously a lot of that. So I think that stands out. But I think just a lot of it is just they operate a lot of service. And again, that's something I think we tend to underestimate a lot, that a lot of transit is just putting transit out there.
Yep. A lot of folks are weighing in on a related part. You mentioned land use. Is it? I mean, just to kind of summarize some of these questions. The transit agencies are responsible for running the transit, right? The land use,
yes,
in every case, as far as I can tell, is not under the purview of the transit agency. Is it different in Canada? And irrespective, what can transit advocates do with this kind of fragmented system of service being operated by an agency, land use being controlled by local governments, and these don't really connect?
So a couple thoughts there. First of all, I was very deliberate in the book in organizing this by metropolitan areas, because good trip is really the responsibility of a metropolitan area. It's not the responsibility purely of a transit agency. If you have a transit agency that's making great decisions, that's embedded in a city that's making really lousy decisions, you are not going to end up with a great transit network. And likewise, the boundaries of transit agencies are often part of the problem, that when you see the numbers on some of these metropolitan areas, the problem is actually that the transit agencies don't cover enough of the metropolitan areas, or there's parts of the metro areas that are uncovered by transit of any kind. Again, that's a metropolitan governance problem. And again, I think there's a pattern that places that have successful transit tend to be places that have some kind of vision at a metropolitan level of what kind of place they want to be. Like, that's why Salt Lake City shows up so nicely, is they actually have a real political buy-in to a vision of what Salt Lake City ought to be like. And that's incredibly important. There is a governance difference in Canada, in that in Canada, it is much more likely for transit systems to be operated by cities. That may lead to some difference. Like, obviously, it means the land use people and the transit people are working for the same boss. But I'm not sure that that's really, I can point to US examples where the transit agency is run by the city that have awful land use policies. And I can point to Canadian examples where the transit agency isn't run by the city, but the land use policies are amazing. Um, and generally, I don't think there's a perfect governance structure. You can have just about any governance structure and end up with good transit, and just about any governance structure and end up with bad transit. I will say something that I can't claim to be an expert about, but that I think also makes a difference in Canadian land use is Canada did not have the same kind of white flight counter reaction to the civil rights movement that the United States did. And I think that both shaped the demographics and land use patterns in Canadian cities, but I also think it shaped the politics in a very profound way and probably led to more lasting support for transit in the core regions, which I think is actually one of the major problems in the United States, is that perception of suburb versus city and what that means for race and class in the United States and what that means for politics in the United States. And Canada doesn't have that problem in the same way. They have their own set of problems, different dimensions, but they don't have that particular problem in that particular way. And I think it has shaped the transit networks.
And it's related to your governance point. I think that just from judging from some of these questions, the fragmented Northeast, with literally hundreds of municipalities within metropolitan borders, each with their own land use planning power, have one governance structure. But then you have the Southeast of the United States with giant counties with very relatively few local governments and not great transit. I think the Southeast United States showed up pretty poor on a lot of your lists. So it's a great takeaway that there isn't one magic governance structure that's going to work in every part of the country. It does require, I think, to put words in your mouth, but this metropolitan ethos that we're going to kind of get it all together, and everybody's going to have to do their part to do these things.
No, and one thing that's interesting in the book is, if you want to compare Northeast to Southeast, is I actually got metro areas in both cases that I think are really good examples of sort of race and segregation playing a role here. Atlanta is a very obvious one, where you have sort of white suburban areas not wanting to be part of the same transit agency as the core, which they perceive as Black. But I think Hartford, Connecticut is actually another one where the entire governance structure of the state of Connecticut was basically created in response to school integration as a way to essentially maintain residential segregation. And that very much shapes the transit of Connecticut. I mean, we have to have those kind of discussions if we talk about transit, because, like I say in the book, I think like race is beneath nearly every US planning discussion. And if we're not willing to talk about it, we're actually missing some really important parts of this discussion.
And it's highly related to kind of a major point in your book. You talk about not getting, and I'm paraphrasing, kind of getting hung up on the difference between the modes, right, between rail or bus, right? But I think one thing that the pandemic has shown is that there is this inequity, right, between the rail systems in many cases and the bus systems, which the latter has played this enormous role, right, in moving people during the pandemic. So how do you parse the inequities that it's inherent between rail riders, which are mostly, I think statistically we know, is suburban white collar workers coming in from the suburbs to the downtowns, and bus riders who are more diverse, more transit dependent, and lower income.
Yeah, no, and I think the really important point is that none of that difference has anything to do with the inherent technology of bus versus rail. The different performance isn't because somehow rubber tires are COVID resistant and steel rails are not. It's how we have used these technologies. And the bottom line of what it comes down to is transit systems which were based around 9 to 5 white collar commutes have seen their ridership go away. Transit systems which are built around serving all kinds of trips for a wide range of different people have seen their ridership stay a lot more during COVID. And to me, there's a really important lesson there, which is we should be planning all-purpose transit. And I think the lesson that some cities are taking away is that actually looking at the rail systems and saying, why aren't these all-purpose transit? I mean, my favorite example is northern New Jersey, where if you look at the population density distribution, northern New Jersey, there's actually rail lines exactly where the people are, except the service on those rail lines is entirely designed around getting people to Manhattan during rush hour. The service patterns, the schedules, like even the way the express trains work, means that you often at rush hour can't catch a train between two stations in New Jersey because they both have their own express services into Manhattan. The complete lack of fare integration with buses, which means that those rail lines can't act as a spine of the bus system. Like, all of that is making it so that those rail lines are not useful for making shorter trips within New Jersey. And if they were, if those rail lines could also get people to the Amazon warehouse and get people to their doctor's appointments and get grocery store workers to the grocery store, that ridership would have held up a lot more. And we have that potential in a lot of places. One of the really cool projects I'm actually working on is reimagining regional rail in Philadelphia, where SEPTA is asking that question: how can we take this infrastructure we have and actually use it to provide service that's useful to more people? So I think we see real opportunities there. And if you look at things like light rail lines, for example, you can really see the different planning philosophies of different cities. So some cities built light rail essentially to connect suburban park and ride lots to downtown jobs and nothing else. That ridership went off a cliff. But the kind of rail lines, like in Houston, it actually got to the point where they had to run bus shuttles in addition to rail because the ridership in the Texas Medical Center did not go away. And to reduce crowding, they actually added bus shuttles alongside the rail line during the peak of COVID. Those are the kind of rail lines where the ridership didn't go away. I think you see the same thing between Minneapolis, St. Paul. I think you saw the same thing in Seattle. So it's not a bus versus rail discussion, but the problem is that I think our idea of what rail is for, our idea of what bus is for, and frankly, our idea of how we treat rail and bus riders is fundamentally broken. And I think that's what we need to reset.
And I can attest to that does play out in northern New Jersey. It's where I grew up, in a place like Secaucus, New Jersey. It is rail, which is funneling a lot of people into Manhattan for good reason. But it shouldn't be the only thing that we're doing. It does set up that bifurcated system. You're 100% right. Let me just then kind of bring up. You knew this was coming, right? There's a lot of questions in here. And I'll just keep it very broad. So what does all this mean post-COVID, right? That there's general comments that are coming in that COVID has changed everything. That transit plays a different role now. How does everything that you've kind of talked about here play out under the conditions we're living through today?
I mean, I'll say, first of all, as a planner, like everybody else, I want to talk about the post-COVID world. I think it's really important to remember we're not close to the post-COVID world. We are still in the midst of this thing. Not just are people still dying every day, but people's patterns of how they live their lives are still very much shaped by COVID right now. You can see I'm working at home. And so number one, we don't really know what the post-COVID world looks like because we haven't seen it yet. Nothing about ridership patterns in the last 2 years is long-term meaningful. Secondly, I think we tend to overestimate how much things like this change. I remember the post 9/11 discussions where people were saying like people are never going to want to work in skyscrapers again. People are never going to want to fly airplanes again. Like even I did a great piece long time ago about sort of natural disasters in cities, and basically natural disasters don't fundamentally change cities. The 1906 earthquake did not change the trajectory of San Francisco, and Katrina really didn't change the trajectory of New Orleans. It kind of amplified things that were already happening, but I think we tend to overestimate change. So I think there will be long-term change due to COVID. I don't think it will be as big as people thought. What I believe very strongly is that transit has an equally important role post-COVID as it does now, simply because of what I said about urban space. Our cities can't function unless transit is part of moving people around. And that doesn't change. What I hope we do is we take sort of the lessons we learned from COVID. And, it's things like we talked about all-purpose transit. Another one I really want to emphasize is COVID has kind of reminded us how tough operating a transit system is, what a hard job it is to be a bus operator. And I'm sorry it took a pandemic killing bus operators to sort of bring that more to the fore. It's something I've been talking about for a long time. We ought to be thinking a lot more about the people who operate our systems, about what their experience, what their work life is like, and how we can make that better. I mean, operator restrooms, really simple stuff. And I think that's the kind of lesson I hope we learn from this, that it sort of pointed out problems we had all along, and maybe it's the impetus for actually fixing them.
I think that the COVID answer, I think you're right. I don't mean it would be overly simplistic, but we're going to need cities, and if we're going to need cities, we're going to need transit. It kind of is. It a little bit is that straightforward.
100% agreed.
Obviously more complicated, but that's the linearity of it. The bus operator question is another kind of contemporary thing. This is certainly playing out every day. There's articles in the newspapers every day about what's happening with bus operator shortages. Yeah, any thoughts on how transit agencies are dealing with that now, and how much of a long-term problem do you think this is?
I mean, I don't know how much of a long-term problem it is. It's definitely worrying. Again, we are in the middle of COVID. I see transit agencies doing some smart things. I see transit agencies paying more attention to this. I'm seeing signing bonuses. I'm seeing raises. Like, I think bus operators ought to be paid better. It's an incredibly hard job. There are a few jobs which combine physical labor, driving skill, and customer service all in one like that. I mean, pay them for it. I think there's a larger pattern to this too, and I think more dimensions to it. Laura Padgett-Seekins did a really good piece about sort of the internal structures of transit agencies, and you know, is a transit operator a job that feels like it has paths to promotion? Like, I think that's a really important. Like, do agencies really value operators? Do operators feel included in that agency? I think we need to think about training. I mean, we can't just take for granted that people want to work for transit agencies. I think it's kind of the bottom line, but there's no simple answer to this. I think it's going to be a lot of different things put together. But one of the things I can very clearly say is we can make quality of life for transit workers a lot better than it is right now. And it's very simple things often. But it's something agencies really need to focus on, not take for granted.
Agree. Couldn't agree more. And if I said the word shortage, I misspoke. We try to stay away from saying there's a operator shortage. I think your point is very well taken. If we treated these workers better, made the jobs easier, which are very difficult right now, there may not be a shortage if they're paid well. Yeah. The jobs aren't so difficult. There's again, just to kind of collect a bunch of these questions. I think a lot of people are on the same page, right? And they believe a lot of things you're saying, and very, very happy to hear your key points. How do you convince others? So what are the key messages that you would use to convince folks, decision makers, political leadership, whatever it is? And I'll say that I think your point about reliability, you mentioned at the very beginning, reliability is literally the difference between keeping your job or not, right? And the business community, I think, in some metropolitan areas is starting to recognize that they're getting behind more frequent bus service because they recognize it's a lifeline for their workers to get to these jobs. But other key strategies for communications and kind of drilling in on some important messages.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will say that very much my experience as a board member is I think people overestimate how much it takes to actually make change happen. Like, I remember in one case, we created an entire new bus route because of one public speaker at a board meeting. So I think point number one is people need to actually engage. And people need to be out there and get the word out there. Like, I'm sure there's some questions about free fares in the chat, and if we get to those, I can talk about that. But what I will say is that's an idea that had a lot of effective organization behind it. The reason you are seeing all these elected officials talking about free fares right now is it was messaged well and advocates pushed for it well. And I mean, it's easy as transit people to talk to other transit people. It's one of the things I love most about my job. There's a lot of cool people in this world who know a lot of interesting stuff. But fundamentally, we have to talk to non-transit people. And I think for the most part, that means actually talking about what transit does and how it helps people. And helping people actually like sort of reset their own mental models of their own cities. It's always, struck me that when I see transit agencies present new projects, often the purpose of the project will be stated as, we are trying to enhance multimodal connectivity in the Highway 239 corridor. And I have no idea what that means. I wish agencies, and that also means the consultants working for the agencies, and it means the public officials who supervise those agencies, were able to explain more in terms of there's two major hospitals and a real big cluster of jobs along this corridor that people are trying to get to, and we want to provide frequent all-day service. Like talk about what you're actually trying to accomplish and talk about it in terms of people's lives. And I think we can be a lot more effective. And just get out there and talk about it. That we just need more people. I mean, I think in the United States, if I look at most metropolitan areas, there's actually a lot of broad popular support for transit, sort of in the generic sense. We've really turned a corner there. We're not in the 1980s where this was very much an uphill fight. I think there are receptive audiences out there. But I think we need to present them with good projects, and we need to explain what those projects will actually do. And we need to be willing to engage in trade-offs. Like that's one of the things about this is there's decisions to be made, and we have to be willing to have those discussions.
And I think there's a ton of evidence for what you're talking about. I mean, we see, just for one metric is at the ballot box, that transit capital investments are very well supported by taxpayers when it's as clear as you mentioned. We're going to raise this tax and we're going to raise it this much. It's going to pay for this and it's going to be here. And when it's laid out that clearly, people are willing to pay for it. 2/3 or 3/4, 80% of these things tend to pass. And so I think it's a good indication of the support that transit has, at least from the capital side. Now, from the operation side, it may be, it's a little squishier, right? But we had a federal government. Good.
Yeah, no, and I think part of our job, if we care about transit, is to figure out how to make people as excited about adding service as about building new stuff.
100%.
Because I think that, again, the support for transit is there. It's telling the story that matters here. But you were just talking about federal funding.
Yeah, just to tie in, just because we're here in Washington, and there's a bunch of questions on what the federal government should be doing. We know the beginning of the pandemic, the federal government really did come to the rescue, and with a lot of money to save operations, again, to provide support for essential workers and others. Then there's a bunch of money for capital. But looking at this now, what do you think the federal government should be doing? They did just give it the office. There may not be a whole lot of money coming anytime in the near future. So what's the appropriate federal role to support the vision you've laid out here?
I mean, I think we should absolutely have a discussion about federal funding on the operations side. Because I think the fact that the feds fund only capital and not operations has definitely sort of distorted US transit systems. That systems which would have benefited most from simply running more service built something because that's what the feds would fund. I think at the very least, it makes sense to almost institutionalize the idea that the federal government can be a crisis backstop on operations. Like one of the long-term stories of US transit is we get a recession, and the recession hits, sales tax revenues go down, transit agencies cut service. And that's almost inescapable from a local standpoint, since the only way to do anything else locally is to operate less service than you can afford, which is not really a great thing to ask an agency to do. And frankly, the funding often tends to get taken away if you do that. But the problem is you're cutting service just when people are on the brink of losing jobs and it's hard to find new ones, and you're actually exacerbating the crisis by cutting that service. So at the very least, we ought to have a discussion about how can we keep transit service steady during economic crises. I also think that on the capital side, there's an awful lot the government could do to promote good capital projects. I mean, first of all, I think there's been some good things done already. I think the government has gotten sort of more skeptical on ridership claims and pushed harder on actually build projects that have good ridership, and has started doing things like saying, we're asking you to guarantee a minimum level of service if we pay you to build this thing, or we're asking you to guarantee a minimum amount of dedicated lanes. I'm very supportive of that. To me, one of the big holes there, though, is that federal policy still favors a single big project over a lot of little ones. There's an awful lot of cities where the best investment would be 1,000 new bus stops, but the feds actually make 1,000 new bus stops awfully hard. that the level of documentation you need to do that is actually quite difficult. And in a lot of ways, it's easy to just build one shiny transit center instead of 1,000 bus stops. I would love to see some federal funding, and I would love to see some really low paperwork federal funding programs. Like imagine a program in which you simply document to the federal government, I have a bus stop, it didn't have a shelter, it has a shelter now, and it has, a minimum level of service, and then the feds just write you a flat amount check for that without even asking you to document all the expenses. Just, you did it, here's your money. Like, that would be transformative. I also think that the feds have an opportunity to use their funding to persuade areas to do things. We talked about fare integration. I could totally see a world in which a lot of federal funding is contingent on fare integration. If you don't do this, your metro area is not getting funding. And I'll say the same thing on transit data. The feds could require everybody to share the same kind of data so that systems are easier to navigate and so that the public has better access to things like ridership data. I think the government can absolutely set standards. And the other thing is, I talked about smaller agencies, and they live in a different world. Large agencies that build lots of stuff and operate lots of stuff have a lot of internal capacity. Small agencies are in a much tougher place there. And I would actually love to see a lot more federal support for that. What if we created some standards for wayfinding and bus stop signs, not as a mandatory thing, but as something that is available to all of these small agencies so they have a really easy time doing this? What if we provided technical assistance? You want a new system map, the feds will actually help you make that map. You want to get your stuff up on Google Maps, the feds will help you create that feed. I think there's a lot we could do to sort of bring these small agencies into the fold who just don't have that internal capacity, and where the feds could be like a real sort of source of expertise and source of help.
All right, you knew it was inevitable. We're gonna have to get into question of free fares.
Yeah, I knew it was coming.
And actually, it's a good point because it does relate to a lot of things you've talked about here. If transit is serving people, I think you mentioned Richmond, Virginia. It's a great example of a transit success story by every measure. A lot of that, I think, is due to the fact that they were able to go fare free and able to provide high quality service. So all of that together kind of helped. But all of this was framed, at least in that region, around access and equity. I'm sure there's many other examples around the country. There's a great examples in Kansas City where there's questions in here about safety and security and what happens with free fares. The folks in Kansas City will tell you that going fare free has eliminated the biggest sources of conflict in the front of the bus, which is the paying the fares between the driver and the customer. So it's complicated, right? We know it's complicated, but I think just love to hear your perspectives on this hot topic.
Right. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, I would like to actually see more of a discussion about why we collect fares, because I think one of the funny things about this is we rarely actually articulate the purpose of fares. And I think sometimes we collect fares just because we think we should. Like there's definitely lower ridership systems, rural systems, suburban systems where the cost of collecting those fares actually exceeds any kind of money that they get. Like in that case, that's a no-brainer to me. Just stop collecting those fares. We should not be collecting fares just to sort of make it seem like transit riders are paying their fair share, because they're paying taxes anyway. Like transit riders are paying their fair share regardless. So I think a discussion of what we're trying to accomplish with fares. Secondly, I think it's really important to think about fares as a friction point. That again, the problem isn't even necessarily, do I have the money to pay for this? It's how do I pay for this? And I can tell you that even as a transit expert, when traveling, there have been instances where I have, say, walked instead of taking transit simply because I couldn't figure out how to pay for the transit. And that shouldn't be a problem. There's been instances where I've like puzzled out, and I've gotten yelled at by an operator for paying wrong. I was in Pittsburgh, and turns out I was supposed to pay when I got off instead of when I got on, which just immensely confusing. So I think we really need to think about fares as a friction point, and sometimes eliminating fares simply because it eliminates that friction makes sense. But in large transit systems, fares do account for a significant portion of the operating budget. And sometimes that may be 50%. It's a lot more likely to be 10%. But even 10% is not nothing. If you think of a 10% cut to transit service, that is not a small cut. So number one, the question is, how do we pay for this without further burdening a transit agency budget that is stretched? And if you are finding additional funding to pay for this, my question would be, does that funding do more good applied to free fares, or does that funding do more good by increasing service? And I think if you actually talk to low-income transit riders, they will frequently tell you their biggest problem is actually lack of service, not that fare. So I think free fares can often be a good solution. I think they are generally good in principle. But I do think we always have to consider the opportunity cost of them, and we also have to consider political priorities. Because my other question would be, if you're going to fight to make transit better, should free fares be the first thing that you fight for?
We did I would share this bus transformation project here in the DC region, and they did a survey of riders, and you're exactly right. We thought that that costs were going to be more of an issue than it was. It certainly was a major concern, but you're right. Frequency, reliability, and safety were top of that list. All of that goes together, there's no doubt. And I think you're right. When agencies are going to be facing a big fiscal cliff coming up when some of this federal money dries up and dealing with the challenges post-COVID. So these are live issues that we're not going to be able to solve here today for sure. Let me ask a couple of specific questions that I think are very interesting, and something that you brought up, which I never thought about, was this issue of integrated stations. You had an image in there at Safeway or CVS or something.
Yeah.
How does that play in? Is that generally a positive thing? How does it go towards fulfilling the vision you've laid out here?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of discussion to be had about the design of stations from a passenger experience standpoint. I mean, first of all, I think we overbuild a lot of infrastructure. Like, I see an awful lot of transit stations in the United States that are like twice as big as they need to be. And that's not a good thing. It actually means you're costing every transit rider time to get there. And it also means like that magic half-mile radius around the station, what is it filled with? And if the answer is it's filled with a transit station, that's not actually useful. You want to get from the transit station to other stuff as quickly as possible. So I think the two things I mentioned is, one, we ought to do a way better job of bus and rail integration. It blows my mind when I'm at like a $50 million rail station or whatever it costs to build a light rail station. And there's bus stops there and you can't get from the rail platform to the bus stop without walking out in the rain. Like, that's simply ridiculous. It means that the passenger experience was not a priority of whoever designed that, since the problem wasn't you couldn't afford it. Problem was that you didn't value it. So like, making those transfers as short as possible, as comfortable as possible, as legible as possible, and as protected from the weather as possible, because water falls from the sky occasionally, I think is incredibly important. But secondly, the integrating with land use, like the more, and this is something like when you're in New York and Boston, like you get out of the station and you're immediately in the middle of things. You're not surrounded by big driveways and parking lots, and that's harder. And city zoning makes it even harder, but I think it's something transit agencies should push a lot harder on. And I think there's also real retrofit opportunities. If you're buying a block of a city in order to build the entrance to a new subway station, why are you not putting 10 stories of affordable housing on top of that block when you're done?
And how about value capture in the same kind of context, right? We make this enormous public investment in public infrastructure. A lot of the benefit accrues to the landowner around it. Have you seen good examples of value capture here in the United States where you work?
Yeah, I mean, the BRT line in Houston I talked about is funded by tax increments. So in a way, that's a value capture. You've definitely seen some joint development opportunities. I will say that, number one, we just got to fund transit. Like, I think the exact mechanism to me is not the most important question. And I think there is such a thing as overdoing the value capture idea. But secondly, I also think that it's important for transit agencies to think about what their goal is here. Like, if you have an area around a station that you can make development happen in, if your goal is to maximize the return on development, you will make different decisions than if your goal is to help your riders, for example. Like, maybe instead of building a high-rise office tower, you should have a grocery store, or maybe you should have both. But thinking about what actually benefits your riders, and I think the affordable housing discussion is a big one there. Like, let's think about what we put around that station and how it makes the system more useful to people. And sometimes that means the transit agency not getting the biggest return on its dollars. One of my favorite examples was at Houston, a previous board actually turned down a redevelopment opportunity above a transit center because the developer who offered the most money was going to build a parking garage so that people could drive to the medical center next door. And the board said, we don't care if that gets us the most money. It's diametrically opposed to our mission, and we're not doing that. And I think agencies need to be willing to do that.
Indeed. And they need to keep the phrase, how do we make the system better for people? That should be the overarching guiding thing. But I'm sure that's the overarching kind of guiding point of your work here. So I just want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us here today and to deal with these great questions and comments. We didn't come close to getting to any of these. I apologize if we didn't get to your questions, but Christof is certainly prolific on all this stuff. Continue to read his writing. He's speaking all over the place. I'm sure we'll get to some of these, at some point. I want to thank you all for your participation. If you'd like more information about ENO, you can check out our website at www.enotrans.org. When you're there, you can check out and subscribe to ENO Transportation Weekly. It's a great and invaluable resource to all things transportation. Again, thanks again, Christof, for taking the time to join us here today. It's great to see you again. There was a discount code there in the last slide. Hopefully people got that. Do go out and buy the book. It's a great read. Thank you all for joining us. Be safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.